British Columbia. He also has a Bachelor of Environmental Studies and Professional Planning from the University of Waterloo School of Planning, and his research areas have included technology affecting the perception of space, urban sustainability, social cohesion in public spaces, and preemptive planning for cities due to climate change.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my pleasure to be invited here to share some insights with you guys. It's going to be kind of different. There's maybe 2 numbers in this whole presentation, so hopefully you all get a little something from it. It's a lot of ideas, but this is really just the first step in what I'm hoping is a long road of research for me and some discussion and dialogue with different partners in aerospace. So I want to start with the necessity part because it's a little pretentious and I don't mean it to be. Really what I want to do first is create this kind of call to action. And how I could put it is when I did my first degree in urban planning, and if you were an architect or an urban planner, and now I go around a city and you see it in a whole different light, right? You pay attention to the buildings in a way you didn't before, the human scale and so on. And then when I did a degree in landscape architecture, I realized there was a whole other area, another 50% of stuff that I was missing when I was walking around those same spaces. So it's not that any one discipline is necessary or important and that a system is going to fail without it, but it adds to the richness of the discussion, and when you have complex problems, you need a robust system. So whenever you have an expert that has something to offer, you know, if you have somebody who looks at a picture of the regolith on Mars sent back and they see opportunity there and they have a little bit of an expertise, I think they are important to bring into a discussion. So just a bit of an overview of what I'm going to go through. First, I start out with a kind of a solution for the human stress problem, and hopefully something you guys could all apply to the architectures you're creating. Whenever we're dealing with human spaces, these kind of 4 rules that I'm going to show you come into play. Next is kind of talking about what landscape architecture does and how that is maybe different from, you know, biosystems engineering, the BLS guys, and where we come in potentially down the road. And then it's kind of a logical progression from my problem statement to some other ideas that could come into play at different time periods for the Evolvable Mars campaign or whatever. So first of all, the problem. What I noticed was when you have a human, there's this problem of stress. It takes a lot of mental activity to pay attention to one thing for a long time. And over time, you're prone to make mistakes. That's the human error problem. So we are not robots. We mentally fatigue and physically fatigue. And right now, the current solution is, you know, let's pick the smartest people, the most physically fit people, and those are our explorers, those are our astronauts. But those people are the best right now, but over an extended period of time, as these missions get longer, that is kind of a short-sighted solution to just say, let's pick the best and let them, you know, deal with whatever. It's going to happen where our mental condition deteriorates, and so you need a predictable and significant solution to act as a countermeasure. So this is where I kind of took a theory from landscape architecture, but it's not necessarily just about landscape architecture, it's about any environment, any spatial environment, this room for example, and then overlaying it onto this human factors model. So there's 5 components in the model, but they all work the same way. You have a stress, and then if you don't intervene, you have a degraded performance, and if you don't intervene again, you have a safety hazard in space that's catastrophic. So we want to try to get into the countermeasure as early as possible, and that's with these 4 rules, which I'm going to go through now. So landscape architecture has a very similar model, and so the first one is being away, and I think this one is the most important. If you take anything from this presentation, it's this. You cannot have recovery in the same environment that causes you stress. So one example is if I'm always in this room, 24 hours a day I'm in this room, just going outside is going to feel fantastic, and that's the thing about being away. Another part of it is a headspace issue. So if I had a computer in this room and nothing else, and I could log into the internet, I could get away there. Or in the previous thing, with the painting and so on. Whenever you have something else you could pay attention to that gets you away from the environment you're in, that is an important thing to have. So it doesn't have to be far, but it has to be separate. So for example, this is being away, watching a game back on Earth. The second one is extend. So it has to do with different components coming together to form a greater whole. So for example, again, if I'm in this room, having this window here is giving me an extent. So it's not my direct environment, but it is an important thing to be able to not be kind of stuck and restricted. So that's where that comes in. Another example. The third one is fascination, which is a spectrum. So whenever you're working on something, it takes a lot of mental energy. So you could have a hard fascination or a soft fascination. A hard fascination means you're focused really strongly on one thing. So researchers that are doing different analysis on the surface of Mars or doing different research studies, that is still a lot of focus, and you need a separate time to restore and recharge. And the fourth one is compatibility. So this is kind of the most complicated one, but it's pretty much just the degree of fit between your environment and what you're doing. So you guys are sitting there, and some of you might not like public speaking. So you're compatible in this environment, but in this same environment, if I said come up here and speak, you're now incompatible with that environment. So hopefully this one will become a little clearer the more we talk. So yeah, I would not want to do that, afraid of heights or something. So I wanted to point out the difference between landscape architecture and biosystems engineering or horticulture. They're probably even more necessary right now. How do we actually grow plants is important, but it is a different thing altogether to say how do we design it to be aesthetically pleasing and to have a benefit in terms of creating a restorative environment. So those four rules are not limited to just green things, but nature is the best application of all four of those. So nature is the best type of restorative environment, and our interaction with it is important for our mental health. So just a little bit about landscape architecture. We're kind of in this weird spot where we're not really art, we're not really science, but we do a lot of things, and we bring a lot of different components together. So when we approach problems, and you will see even in this presentation, there's a lot of big scale stuff and sometimes small scale stuff. In the same project, I could be talking about a regional watershed area, and then also be talking about the paving detail in a very small part of the project, and being able to have that kind of wide range of thinking can be beneficial for complex problems. The second part is the human solution. So we have a lot of engineers in aerospace right now dealing with stuff. This specific group of people, space architects, are looking more at the human factor and the human components. And so landscape architects always are looking at how we could address making people feel more comfortable in spaces. Usually outdoor spaces, but it doesn't have to be limited to that. And then lastly, there's this precedent of nature throughout history being an important part of mental health and healing and so on. So that's the third part, is the therapy. I'm going to introduce 4 different kinds of environments that we are comfortable working in. The first one is green space. So you could have an intervention in a green area, and so this is the rice fields and so on. This is a large-scale intervention. This is a small-scale intervention. They're both in a naturally green area. Next, you have bluescapes, and you have a natural water feature, and then you also have interventions that could be, a pool is another example of a bluescape, for example. But what is the most common these days is grayscapes. So I don't want you to think landscape architecture is ever just dealing with green materials and plants. We do a lot of great things. Everything that is not a building, when you're walking around outside, has been designed. So that's the third one. What I introduced in my work this past year is this fourth one, which is deadscapes. This is the next evolution of environments we need to learn how to deal with. Mars is an example of a deadscape, and which is why I was using it as a way to talk about this. But you have extreme isolated conditions in extreme environments, and you have places that are not necessarily traditional landscape territory that could use the skills of a landscape architect. So again, you guys could say this is how much space these different plants need, this is the capacity and the seeds we need, but how does it get designed and who should be designing that? So I think that's kind of where landscape architects could come in. Speaking on deadscapes, I kind of put together a little animation which we don't have time for, but you can find it on YouTube. The anatomy of Mars. This is all of the layers that make up Mars that is available right now. And there's nothing else to be superimposed on this. So traditionally when we're designing a space, you have a lot to think about. Where's the water coming from through the site? And these days with the way we have technology, I'm currently in Toronto. At the same time, if I have my phone, you have these localities that are superimposed onto one site. But on Mars, this is everything that exists. There's no, that we know of, microorganisms or anything else. So it's a different challenge dealing with this. And since we deal with outdoor environments, I figured this is a great place for us to kind of step in. One part of my project was looking at a specific site. So the end of this video kind of zooms into an area, and I'm going to go through this quickly. I want more time for questions. But this is looking at, how do we get to a specific place, and what does that space feel like? Which brings me to siting. Where are we actually landing, and is that important where we actually land? Is the scientific concern, the research the regions of interest, are those the most important things, or is it also important to consider how the human feels about the site that you're in? So last year they had this first conference figuring out what exploration zones are, and they had these site selection criteria in much greater detail than this. But the question is, can we add something on top of this? Since we can only land in one place at the beginning, we need the best site. So why are we just considering the engineering components when there could be another classification that gives us human-centered understanding of the different sites? So what I did here was put together those 4 components of attention restoration theory with kind of what we'd call traditional siting considerations in landscape architecture to kind of create this matrix of what is the best site. So a valley, setting yourself at the top of a valley versus the bottom is the same as setting yourself at the top of a crater versus the bottom, and so on. So these are just a very simplified version of that. I would ask you guys, where would you, all things removed, engineering things removed, where would you rather be? Would you rather be located here or at the bottom here? The sense of scale is very different, so it's important to consider that, especially as missions get longer. What I did look at was kind of growth of cities on Earth and how different that is when you don't have rivers, when you don't have other people attacking you or wild animals and so on. What kind of growth strategy are we going to be applying when we get to Mars down the road as these communities grow from 50 people to 1,000 people? Landscape architects and urban planners, our concepts don't come to fruition in 5 years or 10 years. These trees take forever to grow, so when you're designing something, you're actually thinking very far down the road. You have a lot of foresight. This would not exist without, a ton of foresight on the part of Frederick Olmsted and the city. So why are we waiting to kind of address those broad-scale growth strategies? I kind of came up with different kinds of growth strategies. What I thought was the best one is this new kind of idea that comes directly, it doesn't come from planning or anything, it comes directly from the literature of attention restoration theory of how do we have being away, which is a very important component of mental health, and applying it to an actual site. So essentially what is happening here is all the black areas, these here would be designated areas for living and working. So when you're going out to the regolith and taking your samples, that's fine. You have your different research areas and target areas that you're trying to get to. We have all 50 of those sites have different target areas, and we need to get to them. But when we have our living and working areas, why do we not also at the same time create designated conservation spaces for the future or whatever that allow areas for gardens or restorative environments to take place? So the scale is kind of hard to understand here, but that's the basic idea, is that you would have living and working and gardens, and the levels of interaction obviously vary. What you could walk to is different from what you could rover to, which is different from what you could just see. And this plan kind of works very well in terms of navigation and wayfinding and a bunch of other things. I'm going to skip through this. I did look at how do we deal with interiors a bit. Again, the deadscapes is places that are not conducive to traditional flora, fauna growth, and so on. So that's not just outside, but that's inside also. How do we design interior spaces for better mental health? Do we just put the plants there on the racks, evenly distributed? Do we look at virtual reality? Do we look at all their alternatives? I didn't get to explore this as much because my faculty was not super into this at the time, but a lot of these are first steps that could be explored down the road. I just want to briefly touch on what these gestures would look like. I kind of break it down into 3 different components. You have things that are simple, putting up a sign that says stop where you have a rover passing by is a mundane thing. It's a very basic thing, but what that does for how do we feel about a space, how does a sign of permanence make us feel like we're at home? You don't have stairs when you're not living in a place. You don't need stairs to go up a hill, but that kind of makes a huge difference of, well, we are here, and how do you feel comfortable in space? Next, you have the signs of the permanence that are picturesque, which is when we actually have lights, and you could take a picture of Mars from a satellite and see lights of people living there, and how that creates hope and the importance of picturesque things. And then way down the road, you have the more sublime things that we have because of all of our history here on Earth. Eventually, we're going to get to these types of bigger gestures of land manipulation and so on. I need to do more research. I think we need to collaborate. These are all very broad things. I would love to apply specifically to any of your design or how do we actually deal with the details and not just have these broad ideas. But these are the basic things that I worked on. So thank you.
It's true that you won't be, the shape of your cities or the growth of your cities won't be based upon, hopefully not based on defense, let's put it that way. You can't guarantee that, I guess.
Right.
But it will be shaped by the landscape.
Right, exactly.
That you're going down valleys or up tributaries or of valleys like this. How does that influence your idea of your skipping over spaces, or the dendritic idea?
Right, exactly. So the reason I think that then the dendritic pattern works the best is because if you come to an obstacle, you split. right? You go around the obstacle. That new branch creates a new division of a restorative environment and so on. It doesn't have to be, I mean, that's a very normal model. That's like a flat area, it's a normal model. But working around the contours of complex spaces, this would work, I think, very well. It's very flexible, but it allows for that, you know, kind of the separateness of spaces, which I think is very important.
I like your research very much, and there are many issues that are important to different areas of research that you pointed out. I just want to see if I understood some of the things that you said.
Sure.
Okay. For instance, when you said there's a dead space, you are posing this to ultra green space.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Dead space to me means that we are not reactive to a certain space. But then when you said, would you prefer to live here or here,
Right.
the green issue was completely put aside, which
Right.
means that there are other components of space
Exactly.
that also have a similar reaction to green spaces. And then the other issue, which I think is quite important, is since you bring so many disciplines, and at the end you listed them, I'm interested in knowing if you, as a landscape architect, would adopt for this dendritic split and pattern, if you would adopt an interdisciplinary, going into each of the disciplines, or a more multidisciplinary, where you have the different disciplines, but they are separate in the way you look at them and you use them, or if it's more an intra, which is above it all, since it's landscape architecture. So you have also here a completely different approach, whether it's intra or whether it's multi or interdisciplinary, because these are complex areas.
Okay, so to address the first point, I didn't want to say that the good spaces are green spaces. We don't need them to be green spaces. Simply being the difference of being on top or being down is one difference in restorative, which space feels better. But really all that you have to pay attention to are the first four. You could have a city environment, a very gray space that it's not so much about what the initial space is, but the changes in behavior, that is what's important. So it's not so much whether this space here is gray and then I move to a green space. It's simply the act of moving into a different space. And so those four could be applied to a range of different spaces. So to say deadscape is kind of sad, and what I mean by that is you have an extreme condition and we're creating intervention to make it more habitable. And then in terms of the second part, I think the interdisciplinary approach is something that I would prefer. Typically, landscape architects work in a very multidisciplinary way. So in any given project, we're not necessarily the leader. You have a lead that has a problem, and the landscape architects deal with a particular part of the problem. I think an interdisciplinary approach works better for complex issues. So that's a difference of personal opinion, but either one works, I guess. It's just can't be by itself. Nobody should be by themselves. Yeah.
If I could follow up on that just a little bit, you showed a matrix with your four by something,
Yeah.
and then asked us what would we rather have. Can I ask you, does your research tell you what we would like?
No, it does not. It does not. Because that was just an example of how you could create a means of prioritizing different things. That's my own personal just way of showing that. You would need studies to find out what is the actual most preferable option.
Okay, so you've been studying and we haven't.
Yeah.
And you bring up some very interesting points about why we as humans have cited our habitations in the past.
Yeah.
And visiting castles and stuff around here is a prime example of why you would build up high.
Right.
Is that it? That's
Yeah.
a practical thing, but again, so a very simple question. Would we do okay in a valley?
Yes, we would. We don't have the same kind of pressures that we did when we were siting cities on Earth. So we would do just fine in the valley. And really, actually, while my personal preference might be to look down, being in a valley in a labyrinth type geological pattern there, like, you know, your Noctis over there, that might actually feel more natural because it mimics building cities the way that the valley would be streets and you would have things go around you. Usually we are situated by water and you have mountains around. Water is the main resource, so it's actually better probably to be in the valley, but that's not my preference. So there's a whole, yeah, I hope that answer it.
Barbara?
Yeah, I just wondered, thank you for your presentation, it's very good. All these classifications you take, is there some kind of precedence, or are you kind of, through literature coming up with your, for yourself with that, or
Yeah.
the grade, the fascination, the compatibility, and all these?
Okay, so those four are literature. Dozens and dozens of papers that have been studied. They have tried to look at more, like novelty, mystery, all these different things that are subcategories, but they don't statistically, they're not as statistically significant indicators. So you can't predictably say whether those other subdivisions are going to perform. Those four consistently perform regardless of the environment. So which is why I stuck with those. The other ones are kind of what you would go into, if I'm designing the park down there, I would want to add mystery, the way you have hedges come up to a certain level and so on. But that's more talking about aesthetics and design. These four are...
Something usual in landscape architecture?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm wondering the relationship in your mind between landscape design and infrastructure. And you talked about siting, we site next to a river, resource concern. At Mars, I could say that we can site in the valley because it's more air pressure or better radiation shielding to be next to a cliff.
Great.
So I'm wondering if you can find it, and also, the way that we structure cities or the way that we structure urban situation on Mars, I assume would have a lot to do with how we're transporting the resources or the roads and all that stuff. So I'm wondering where you see the overlaps between infrastructure and landscape.
I would have liked to explore that a lot more. I was kind of pressured to cut off some of my work a little short and pursue other things like designing a specific site and whatnot. But I think there are lots of ways that those two would overlap, and I'd love to talk about it more and write more and all those things, but yeah.
Another question,
Yeah.
it's a comment. So in 2001, I guess it was 2002, a bunch of us here and others had the first space architecture symposium. We wrote called the Millennium Charter and about space architecture. And one of the topics that we included in the family of subjects for space architecture is landscape architecture. It's nice to see we finally caught one. So don't escape, keep going. I agree with Barbara. This is very stimulating, and it's just nice to see the conversation getting richer at this point. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, that's all I could hope for. It was a struggle to catch me. I had to work it like that. I was telling her in the hallway that them winning that competition and me pointing to the fact and saying, "Look, there's a."